It was an overcast afternoon when Miss Marple, seated in her favourite armchair by the window of her cottage in St. Mary Mead, received the letter. It was delivered by a breathless messenger, a young man with an air of urgency in his demeanour. The envelope was thick, cream-coloured, and sealed with dark red wax. Miss Marple peered at the seal for a moment before carefully breaking it open, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. The letter was brief, but its contents were enough to stir her curiosity. "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this note finds you well. I write to you with an urgent request that I believe only your sharp mind can untangle. A strange and perplexing situation has unfolded at the Bell Tower estate. A crime has been committed, and the local constabulary is at a loss. I trust you will understand the gravity of the situation and come at once. Yours sincerely, Monsieur Rutherford." The Bell Tower estate was an imposing, centuries-old manor located on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. It was known for its towering bell tower that loomed over the surrounding land, its stone walls draped in ivy, and its vast grounds shrouded in mystery. Miss Marple had passed it many times, but had never been invited inside. She wondered now if this letter would change that. That evening she donned her warmest coat, tied her scarf with meticulous care, and set off toward the estate. The evening maze fog clung to the countryside like a thick blanket, muffling the world around her. The drive to the estate took longer than expected, and by the time she arrived, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. A cold chill settled in the air as she was greeted by the butler, a tall, thin man with an expression that could only be described as anxious. "Miss Marple, I presume?" "Please do come inside," he said, his voice low but polite. "Master Rutherford is expecting you." The house was dimly lit, shadows cast by the tall, narrow windows. They walked down a long hallway, the echo of their footsteps reverberating against the walls. Miss Marple's eyes darted to the portraits that lined the walls, men and women of past generations, their eyes following her every move. It was a place where secrets seemed to linger in every corner. At the end of the hall, she was led into a large drawing room where a tall man, perhaps in his mid-50s, stood near the fire, his posture stiff and weary. This was Monsieur Rutherford, the master of the estate. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and unease. "Thank you for coming. I hope you can shed some light on this dreadful situation." "Of course, Mr. Rutherford," she replied, settling into an armchair with the grace of someone far younger than her years. "What seems to be the trouble?" Rutherford hesitated, his brow furrowing. "It's my daughter, Eleanor. She's gone missing." His voice faltered slightly. "She was last seen earlier today, just before noon in the library. But when I went to check on her an hour later, she was gone. There's no sign of her. Nothing to suggest she left voluntarily." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers lightly resting on the armrests. "I see. And you've searched the house thoroughly, I presume?" "Of course," Rutherford said, pacing slightly. "We've scoured every room, every corner, but it's as though she vanished into thin air. The windows were all locked, the doors were undisturbed. There's only one clue." He gestured toward the center of the room where a single, small object lay on a table. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she looked at the object. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bell, the kind one might find in a curio shop, placed among trinkets and oddities. "This is the clue?" she asked, her voice soft but keen. "Yes," Rutherford replied. "It was found on the floor of the library near her desk. There's no explanation for it. Eleanor never had any interest in bells. And yet it was there, a strange, meaningless trinket. Or perhaps not. I can't understand why it would be there. Miss Marple stood, her old bones creaking slightly, and moved closer to examine the bell. It was odd, small but carefully carved, and there was something about it that struck her as deliberate. A faint smell of wood polish lingered on the surface, and she could see faint fingerprints around its base. It seemed entirely out of place in the otherwise well-ordered room. "I trust you've looked for other signs, Mr. Rutherford. Any indication that your daughter left willingly?" Miss Marple asked, turning to face the man. Rutherford ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Nothing. No notes, no signs of struggle. It's as though she simply vanished. I've had the constables search the grounds, but there's no trace of her anywhere." Miss Marple stood silent, for a moment, considering the details. "Is there anyone who might have had reason to harm her, Mr. Rutherford? A family dispute, perhaps? Any enemies that she may have made?" Rutherford's face darkened at the question. "Not that I know of. Eleanor she was well liked. She had friends, yes, but no enemies, at least none that I'm aware of. She had been acting oddly in the days leading up to her disappearance, but nothing that would indicate she was in danger. Still, she kept to herself more than usual. And, I wonder, could this be connected to something we don't know about?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her mind turning over the possibilities like a carefully shuffled deck of cards. She took a deep breath and moved toward the door. "I would like to see the library for myself." The library was at the far end of the house, a grand room lined with bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling. Miss Marple immediately noticed the lack of personal items, no photos, no letters, no small mementos of the kind one might expect in a room that belonged to a young woman. It was as if Eleanor had carefully removed herself from everything familiar, leaving only the barest traces behind. "Do you mind if I have a look around?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent. "Please," Rutherford said, though there was an edge of unease in his tone. "You'll see for yourself. We found nothing of note, but perhaps you will." She began to inspect the room, her eyes sweeping over the shelves, the desk, and the small decorative items that dotted the surfaces. Nothing seemed particularly out of place until she came to the window. It was a tall, narrow affair, with thick drapes hanging on either side. Miss Marple pulled the drapes back, peering outside. The view was partially obscured by the heavy fog, but there was something about the angle of the window that caught her attention. A single footprint was visible on the sill, a faint but distinct mark in the dust. It was fresh. "Mr. Rutherford," she called, her voice now sharp with focus. "It seems your daughter did leave after all." Rutherford's face paled. "But the window was locked." Miss Marple smiled quietly. "The window is locked, yes, but that does not mean she did not climb out before it was locked again." She turned her attention back to the bell on the table. Her fingers lightly traced its contours, and she suddenly had a thought. "This bell, could it belong to the bell tower?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she focused on Rutherford. He blinked in surprise. "The bell tower? Of course, yes, it could very well be, but why would Eleanor leave such a thing behind?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The bell, I believe, is the key to understanding where she has gone." Miss Marple's sharp eyes lingered on the bell, still resting on the table in front of her. The more she considered it, the more it seemed the key to the mystery was hidden within its simple design. But her thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough from behind her. She turned to find Rutherford standing uneasily in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the bell. "Is there something I've missed?" he asked, his voice strained. Miss Marple didn't immediately respond. She had always preferred silence when something needed to be processed, and right now, her mind was working, swiftly piecing together what seemed to be the beginnings of a much larger puzzle. Finally she spoke, her tone as measured and deliberate as ever. "The bell. It isn't just a trinket," she said softly, almost to herself. "I suspect it's a signal, or a marker, something meant to mislead." Rutherford's brow furrowed in confusion, but Miss Marple didn't elaborate. Instead, she moved toward the door of the library where she could hear the sounds of voices drifting from the hallway. It seemed that the local constabulary had finally arrived to investigate in full force. "Would you mind if I took a look at the bell tower?" Miss Marple asked, glancing at Rutherford over her shoulder. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his face growing pale. "It's not that I don't trust you, Miss Marple, but—" His voice trailed off, and he seemed uncomfortable with the notion. "I understand your hesitation," she said gently, offering a reassuring smile. "But if I am to help, I must see everything, both the obvious and the hidden." With a reluctant sigh, Rutherford led her through the labyrinth of corridors that made up the ancient house. They ascended a narrow staircase, the stone steps worn smooth from centuries of use, and came to a large wooden door. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. Through a narrow, arched window, Miss Marple could see the full expanse of the fog-drenched grounds below. The bell tower was silent. Not a single ring disturbed the heavy air. Miss Marple stepped carefully across the floor, noting the dust that coated every surface, untouched by time, save for a single fresh footprint in the corner. She crouched to inspect it, her keen eyes narrowing as she traced the edges of the mark in the dust. "This," she murmured, "isn't a footstep made by a person who has been here before. It's fresh. Very recent." Rutherford looked over, her shoulder, his expression shifting uneasily. "You're certain? It could just be from a passing bird, or—" "No," Miss Marple interjected quietly, raising a hand to stop him. "This is deliberate, a heavy foot pressing down as it reached for something." Her eyes flicked to the bell itself. It had been placed on the table with care, she noted, but the shape of the footprint led toward the large bell rope on the far wall. As she examined it, a cold shiver crept up her spine. The bell rope, long and frayed from years of disuse, had recently been pulled. The marks left on the rope, jagged and uneven, told the story of someone who had hastily yanked it down. Perhaps too hastily. "Has anyone used the bell recently, Mr. Rutherford?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent. He shook his head. "No, it's been years since it was last rung. We don't use it for anything. It's a relic of the past." "That's odd," Miss Marple replied, still staring at the rope. "This rope is worn, but not in a way that suggests it's been idle for long. Someone recently used it, and not with the care one might expect from someone familiar." With the bell tower, Rutherford swallowed nervously, the colour draining from his face. "But Eleanor, she couldn't have—" "Couldn't have what, Mr. Rutherford?" Miss Marple cut in. "Climbed up here and rung the bell? It's possible, but we need more than speculation." She turned to him sharply. "Where were the servants when this happened?" Rutherford seemed taken aback by the question. as if it had never occurred to him. The servants? They were in their quarters, I assume. Why? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the bell rope and gave it a light tug. The sound was faint but telling. The bell was still functional, though it had not been rung in years. It would have been easy for someone to climb the tower, use the rope, and then return unnoticed, especially with the fog masking their presence. Suddenly, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to something even more peculiar. There, in the far corner of the bell tower, a small metallic glint caught her eye. She moved toward it, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. At first, it appeared to be a loose nail or perhaps an old discarded piece of machinery. But as she bent down, she realized it was something else entirely, a small golden key. It was tucked beneath a loose floorboard, barely visible, but unmistakably there. Her heart quickened as she lifted it carefully, turning it over in her palm. The key was old, beautifully crafted, and had a worn, familiar feel to it, as though it had been carried for years. The engraving was faint but legible. A single letter, E. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the engraving thoughtfully. "This, I believe, is the key to a very different door." She stood slowly, tucking the key into her pocket. "Mr. Rutherford," she said, her voice sharper now, "I think it's time we spoke to the servants. Perhaps they know more than they've let on." The servants' quarters were located in the lower part of the house, a series of small rooms at the back. As they descended the staircase, Miss Marple couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the more she uncovered, the more questions arose. Who had Eleanor been speaking to recently? Why had she felt the need to leave the house without warning? And most importantly, who had made the deliberate attempt to hide their tracks in the bell tower? As they reached the servants' quarters, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in every detail: the small, tidy rooms, the faint smell of lavender from a nearby cleaning rag, and the uneasy expressions of the staff who had gathered in the common room. "What do you know about the events earlier today?" Miss Marple asked, her voice polite but firm. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Drayton, was the first to speak. "We heard the bell ring, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "but none of us were near the bell tower. We thought it was a mistake, someone pulling the rope by accident." "A mistake, you say?" Miss Marple repeated, her gaze sharp. "Or was it deliberate?" The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the others in the room. I don't know, miss. But there's something strange about the way things have been around here lately. The master's daughter, she wasn't herself." "Strange how?" Miss Marple pressed, her interest piqued. Mrs. Drayton swallowed hard, then whispered, "I heard her talking to someone last week. Someone she seemed to be hiding from. I couldn't make out the name, but it wasn't anyone she knew. It was all hushed, and when she saw me, she told me to forget it." The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Miss Marple knew there was more yet to uncover. "Who was she hiding from, Mrs. Drayton?" she asked softly, her eyes narrowing with anticipation. But before the housekeeper could respond, a loud knock echoed through the hallway, signaling the arrival of a new visitor, someone who was about to turn the investigation on its head. The knock on the door startled the room, the sound sharp and insistent. Miss Marple turned, her keen eyes narrowing. The tension that had settled in the servants' quarters seemed to intensify, and the housekeeper's nervous glance confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. Something was about to shift. Something crucial was about to surface. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, well-dressed man in his mid-30s. He had a striking presence with sharp features, dark hair, and eyes that flickered with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. His clothes were immaculate, but the faint creases at his cuffs betrayed a hasty departure from somewhere else. "Ah, Mr. Fenton," Rutherford greeted, his voice thick with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "What brings you here?" The man, Mr. Fenton, didn't immediately acknowledge the question. Instead, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. His eyes flicked over her in a way that suggested he had already sized her up, and the air between them thickened with unspoken tension. "I've come to speak with the authorities about Eleanor's disappearance," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "I understand you've been investigating, Miss Marple. I'd like to offer my assistance." Miss Marple didn't react to the overture. She had learned long ago to take such words with a grain of salt. People who were eager to offer help often had their own reasons for wanting to steer an investigation. She studied him carefully. There was an odd tension about him, a sense of trying to stay just out of reach. "Assistance, Mr. Fenton?" Miss Marple's voice was polite but firm. "How exactly do you plan to assist?" He hesitated only for a moment, and then the smoothness returned to his demeanor. "I was Eleanor's confidant. We spent a great deal of time together in the last few weeks. If anyone knows her state of mind, it's me. I'm sure I can provide valuable insight into her disappearance." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the housekeeper, who had stepped back into the corner of the room, and then to Rutherford, whose face had gone ashen at the mention of Fenton's proximity to his daughter. She took a slow breath, her gaze never leaving Fenton's. "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but piercing. "And how is it that you came to know Eleanor so well, Mr. Fenton?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We shared interests, books, music, intellectual pursuits. It was only natural for us to spend time together." "But I understand you were also a frequent guest here at Bell Tower Estate," Miss Marple continued, her voice drawing out each word like a careful thread. "Would it be fair to say that you and Eleanor had a special connection?" For the briefest moment, Fenton's face tightened, the mask slipping just enough for Miss Marple to catch a glimpse of something darker beneath. "I would hardly call it special, Miss Marple," he said with a quick chuckle. "But yes, we did enjoy each other's company." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You wouldn't happen to have been in the library earlier today, would you, Mr. Fenton?" Fenton's eyes shifted just for a second, but it was enough to make Miss Marple's suspicion grow. "I was not," he replied smoothly. "I've been in my study all morning. Perhaps someone else can confirm that." Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her mind was already piecing together the contradictions. The man was too polished, too rehearsed. His answer was just a bit too quick, his gaze too steady. She made a mental note to return to him later. Before she could speak again, Mrs. Drayton, the housekeeper, spoke up in a tremulous voice. "I did see Mr. Fenton on the grounds this morning, right before lunch. He was heading toward the garden, though I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the housekeeper. "And did you see him at any point near the library or the bell tower?" Mrs. Drayton looked hesitant, then shook her head. "No, miss. Not directly near them. But he was close. It was strange, though, now that I think on it. He seemed agitated, as though he was in a hurry." Fenton's jaw tightened at the housekeeper's words, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle shift in his posture. "I was simply taking a walk, Mrs. Drayton," he said coolly. There's nothing strange about that. No, of course not, Miss Marple responded, her voice light, but the sharpness beneath it didn't go unnoticed. But perhaps we should continue with our questions. I'm sure there's much more to this story. With a soft murmur of agreement, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the rest of the servants, all of whom had been watching the exchange intently. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and unease, but Miss Marple saw through the mask of politeness. She addressed one of the maids, a young woman named Agnes, who seemed particularly uncomfortable with the presence of the others. Agnes, you mentioned earlier that Eleanor had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her disappearance, Miss Marple began. Can you tell me more about that? The young maid's hands fidgeted in her lap, and she bit her lip before responding. I don't know much, miss, but there were times when she seemed distracted, as though she wasn't all here, if you know what I mean. She would speak to herself sometimes as though in a trance, and she would glance toward the bell tower even when no one was around. It wasn't like her. Miss Marple studied her closely, her mind racing as she recalled the strange behavior mentioned by others. The bell tower, you say? And was she alone when you noticed this? Agnes nodded, her eyes wide. Yes, Miss Marple. But she was never in the tower itself, just looking at it, sometimes with a kind of longing. It's as though it called to her. And did she speak of anything unusual in those moments? Miss Marple pressed. Agnes hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and fear. She never said anything out loud, but there were times when I thought she was going to go inside, like she was waiting for someone, though no one ever came. Miss Marple turned this new information over in her mind. Eleanor's strange behavior, her fixation on the bell tower, and the cryptic feeling Agnes had given about someone waiting. It all suggested something more than just a simple disappearance. Eleanor had been lured there, perhaps, by someone she trusted. But who? Just then Fenton spoke again, his voice cutting through her thoughts. If you're finished questioning the staff, Miss Marple, I believe we should focus on finding Eleanor, not on idle gossip. Miss Marple turned slowly to face him, her eyes cool and steady. I believe, Mr. Fenton, that you may be trying to move the conversation in a direction that suits you. You're eager to avoid the subject of the bell tower, aren't you? Fenton's expression flickered just for a moment before he composed himself. I assure you, Miss Marple, I have no interest in the bell tower. My concern is with Eleanor's safety. Oh, I'm sure it is, she replied softly, her eyes locking with his. But I wonder, Mr. Fenton, if you're telling us the truth, or if perhaps you know more about what happened to Eleanor than you're willing to admit. Fenton's smile never faltered, but Miss Marple saw the briefest flicker of something darker in his eyes, something hidden beneath the surface, something he wasn't yet willing to reveal. And then, as the conversation continued to spiral in new directions, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel that the truth was slipping just beyond their grasp. But it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The investigation was no longer a simple search for a missing woman. The deeper Miss Marple delved, the more it seemed that every person involved had something to hide, some hidden agenda that blurred the lines between truth and deception. She sat in the quiet of the library, the weight of the case pressing down on her. The suspects were becoming clearer, their motivations more tangled, but the truth remained elusive, like a shadow that refused to take form. Rutherford, the father, had shown genuine concern for his daughter's disappearance. Yet there was a coldness to him, something that didn't sit right. He had been Eleanor's protector, yes, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that suggested he might know more than he was letting on. He had the most to lose if Eleanor were to uncover something that would ruin him, something that might have been hidden in the depths of Bell Tower Estate. Then there was Mr. Fenton. Miss Marple had no doubt that he was hiding something. His polished demeanor and eagerness to cooperate with the investigation didn't mask the fact that he had been too quick to present himself as a confidant of Eleanor's. His own presence on the estate during crucial moments, combined with the uneasy tension that always seemed to follow him, suggested he might have played a far more pivotal role in Eleanor's disappearance than he let on. And now the servants, especially the housekeeper, Mrs. Drayton, had started to reveal cracks in the stories they'd initially told. While it was true that Mrs. Drayton had shown concern for Eleanor's well-being, she too had been in the vicinity when things began to unravel. There was something in her hesitation, something in the way she spoke of Fenton's movements on the estate, that made Miss Marple wary. Had Mrs. Drayton seen something she wasn't saying, or had she played her part in a much darker plot? Miss Marple had spent hours listening to the servants' accounts, each one offering different versions of the same events, each story shifting just slightly to avoid confrontation. The contradictions were small but significant, too eager to help one moment, too hesitant to answer the next. She could feel the walls of deception closing in on her, each piece of information fitting together like the fragments of a broken puzzle. And then there was the bell tower. Eleanor's strange obsession with the place, her fixation on it in the days leading up to her disappearance, couldn't be dismissed. It was becoming clearer with each passing moment that the bell tower held the key to the entire mystery, if only Miss Marple could unlock it. She stood up, pacing in the quiet library, her mind whirring. She needed to focus. There was a pattern here, but it was elusive, like a dream slipping away just as it was about to be understood. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Rutherford entering the room, his face lined with worry. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "I've been thinking over everything you've said, and I believe I might know what's going on." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, allowing him to continue. "You see," he began, his voice growing softer, "Eleanor's mother, my late wife, was involved in something before she died. I never told anyone this, not even Eleanor, but there were financial troubles, investments, debts. It was all very complicated, and I thought I had handled it. But perhaps I didn't." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "You believe these financial troubles are connected to Eleanor's disappearance?" Rutherford hesitated, then nodded. "I fear Eleanor may have stumbled upon something I thought was buried. A part of me thought she might be in danger, but I never expected her to disappear like this. If someone found out, if they knew what she was uncovering, I don't know what lengths they might go to." His words hung in the air, but Miss Marple wasn't quite ready to make the connection yet. She was beginning to see that each person had a hidden motive, a reason to conceal something that they didn't want uncovered. "And Mr. Fenton?" she asked carefully, her eyes narrowing. "What of him? Is he involved in your wife's financial dealings?" Rutherford's face flickered just for a moment. "Fenton? I don't know what he's involved in, but he's certainly more than he lets on. He's been here long enough to know a great deal about the estate and its history. He's also been closer to Eleanor than I ever realized. That alone worries me." Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. Fenton's ties to the estate were far too convenient, and his behavior had been increasingly suspicious. The way he avoided certain questions, the ease with which he deflected attention from the bell tower, all suggested he had something to hide. "I need to speak to Fenton again," Miss Marple said, her voice firm with resolve. "There's more to him than meets the eye." As she made her way toward the study where she knew Fenton was likely to be, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Rutherford's financial troubles, the strange behavior of Eleanor, Fenton's inexplicable presence on the estate. It was all too perfect, too neatly arranged. And yet there was still a thread missing, a crucial detail that connected everything together. When Miss Marple arrived at the study, she found Fenton sitting at a large oak desk, his hands steepled in front of him, his expression thoughtful. He looked up when she entered, his smile flickering for just a moment before settling into a calm, practiced expression. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "I was hoping we might have another conversation." "I'm sure you were," Miss Marple replied, her voice cool, "and I'm sure you're hoping that I won't ask any more questions about your connection to Eleanor, but I'm afraid that's exactly what I intend to do." Fenton's gaze didn't waver, but Miss Marple could see the slight tension in his shoulders. "I've already told you everything I know," he said, his tone barely masking impatience. "I care deeply for Eleanor and I want to help. I'm sure you can appreciate that." Miss Marple nodded, stepping closer. "Tell me, Mr. Fenton, when did you last see Eleanor?" Fenton's eyes flickered for a brief moment. "This morning, before I went to my study. She was distant, preoccupied with something, though I couldn't say what." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And did she mention the bell tower?" The slightest pause. "No, she didn't. But that's hardly unusual, Miss Marple. Eleanor often kept her thoughts to herself." Miss Marple's gaze never left his face. She could see the lie beneath his words, the hesitation that betrayed him. "I find that hard to believe, Mr. Fenton," she said quietly, "especially when she had been so fixated on it recently." Fenton shifted uncomfortably, but Miss Marple pressed on. "Did she tell you about the key, Mr. Fenton?" His eyes narrowed at the mention of the key, and for the first time the calm mask slipped completely. "What key?" he asked, his voice a little too sharp. Miss Marple smiled, though it was more of a warning than a gesture of kindness. "The one we found in the bell tower, the one engraved with the letter E. It's curious, isn't it?" Fenton's expression faltered for just a moment, and in that instant Miss Marple knew. The key wasn't just a symbol of Eleanor's obsession, it was the key to understanding what had truly happened. The connections, the motives, and the people involved were all tied to that small, seemingly insignificant object. "You see, Mr. Fenton," Miss Marple continued softly, "I think it's time we stop pretending. The game is over." Fenton's lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear now that he had more to answer for than he was willing to admit. And Miss Marple was getting closer to the heart of the mystery than anyone had imagined. The motive maze was beginning to unravel. Fenton's sudden shift in demeanor told Miss Marple all she needed to know. His earlier confidence crumbled under the pressure of the truth she was presenting. He leaned back in his chair, his hands tightening around the edge of the desk, his jaw working silently as if searching for a way to extricate himself from the trap that was quickly closing around him. "You've misunderstood, Miss Marple," Fenton said, his voice forced and low. "I have no knowledge of any key. I don't know what you're insinuating, but I'm telling you the truth. Eleanor and I were—" "I'm sure you were." Miss Marple interrupted gently, her voice smooth like the calm before a storm. "But the key tells a different story, Mr. Fenton. It's not just some forgotten object. It's a message, a clue, and you're not as innocent in all of this as you would like us to believe." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence in the room, thick and suffocating. Fenton's gaze shifted from her face to the door, and then to the window, as if weighing his options, but the weight of the situation had shifted. Miss Marple was no longer asking questions. She was making him face the truth, one piece at a time. Before Fenton could respond, the door opened and Rutherford entered, a look of alarm on his face. "Miss Marple, we've found something. He stopped abruptly, noticing the tension in the room, the unspoken confrontation hanging thick between them. "Is there something you need to tell me?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Miss Marple studied the two men before answering, but she knew this was just the beginning. They hadn't yet cracked the case, not truly, but the key, the literal key, was something more than just a minor detail. It was the first breakthrough, a tangible piece of the puzzle, and yet something felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the feeling gnawed at her like a shadow lurking just out of sight. "What have you found, Rutherford?" Miss Marple asked, pushing her unease aside. She had to stay focused. Rutherford hesitated, then pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was stained, as though it had been folded and refolded numerous times. He handed it to Miss Marple, his hand trembling slightly. "It was in Eleanor's room, hidden under the floorboards," he said. I don't know how it got there, but it was the last place anyone would have thought to look." Miss Marple unfolded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the handwriting, the words jarring in their clarity. It was a confession, in Eleanor's own hand. "If you're reading this, then it's too late. They've found out, and I fear what will happen next. The bell tower holds the truth, but I can't reach it. I'm being watched. Trust no one, not even those closest to you. The key is my only hope. But even with it, I don't know if I can make it out in time." Miss Marple's mind raced, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she read the words. It was clear now that Eleanor had known something that threatened the delicate web of lies surrounding Bell Tower Estate. And now, the key was more than just a symbol. It was a lifeline, an escape, a way for Eleanor to reveal the truth before it consumed her. But who was watching her? Who was close enough to control her actions, to keep her from reaching the bell tower? Miss Marple? Rutherford's voice was anxious, his brow furrowed. "What does this mean? What does it tell us?" She handed the paper back to him, her mind whirling. "It tells us that Eleanor was close to something dangerous, and someone didn't want her to find it." Just then, a knock sounded at the door, and before anyone could respond, Chief Inspector Blake entered, his face tight with concern. "I've got news," he said, his voice low. "We've located Eleanor's body." The room fell into a stunned silence. Miss Marple felt a chill run through her, but she didn't flinch. She had known this would come, yet the reality of it still hit like a punch to the gut. Eleanor was dead. Blake continued, his expression unreadable. "We found her in the woods just beyond the estate. It seems she was dragged there. But what's strange is that she was holding something. A small metal object." He paused, watching Miss Marple closely. "It was the key." A small gasp escaped from Rutherford, and his face drained of colour. The key? But how? How did she have it? Miss Marple spoke before anyone else could. She was trying to get to the bell tower, she said, her voice cold and steady. She knew what it meant, and she tried to use it to escape. Rutherford sank into a nearby chair, his face lined with grief, though there was something hollow about his expression, something that wasn't entirely about sorrow. Blake, for his part seemed satisfied with the conclusion, nodding in approval. We've got a solid lead now. This case will be solved quickly. Fenton, you're under suspicion. We'll need you to come with us. Fenton stood without hesitation, his face a mask of frustration. I'm not the one you should be questioning, he said, his voice harsh. I've told you everything I know. Eleanor's death, it's not my fault. Miss Marple raised her hand, halting him mid-sentence. And yet, Mr. Fenton, you were in the vicinity of the bell tower the morning of Eleanor's disappearance. You've been here longer than you admit, and you've had too much opportunity to interfere with her investigations. She turned to Blake. I believe the real culprit is still here in this house. I'm certain of it. Blake looked at her sharply, his brow furrowing. You're not suggesting— No, Miss Marple cut him off. I'm suggesting that Eleanor's death was orchestrated by someone who wanted to make it look like an accident. They placed the key in her hand to give the appearance of a resolution, to throw us off the trail. A wave of realization passed over Blake's face. But before he could speak, Rutherford stood up abruptly, his eyes wild. This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. Eleanor was my daughter and I loved her. Why would I? Miss Marple held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. It's not about what you loved, Mr. Rutherford. It's about what you were willing to protect. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it. And you were protecting more than just your reputation. You were protecting something that would have been exposed if Eleanor had lived. Rutherford's eyes flashed with something far colder than grief. It was the look of someone who knew they were cornered, but didn't yet understand how to fight their way out. The room was thick with tension as Blake turned back to Miss Marple. Do you think he did it? Miss Marple stood motionless for a moment, her mind clearing, the pieces clicking into place. I'm not sure yet, but I know one thing for certain. We've been handed a false victory. The real criminal is still hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to make our next move. She felt the weight of the case press heavier than ever, but she also knew that this was only the beginning. The truth was closer, but it was still shrouded in shadows. The key to the mystery wasn't just a literal object. It was a symbol of deception, of a game being played by someone far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. And Miss Marple had no intention of letting them win. Not yet. The next morning, Miss Marple sat quietly in her room, her thoughts swirling like a storm cloud. The case had reached an impasse, and though the authorities were satisfied with their progress, something in her gut told her that the truth was still eluding them. There was a thread, a delicate one, that she hadn't yet pulled, and it seemed just out of reach, taunting her with the promise of revelation. The sun had barely risen when Blake, his face creased with frustration, found her. Miss Marple, he said, his voice taut, we've made another discovery. I think you need to see this. Without a word, Miss Marple followed him to the study, where Rutherford, looking more haggard than before, was already seated. In front of him was a large file. its contents spilling out in disarray. Blake gestured for Miss Marple to take a seat. "It's an old case," Blake began, his fingers flipping through the papers. "One that was dismissed years ago. It seems there were connections between this estate and a string of financial frauds that took place decades ago. I didn't think it would be relevant, but... well, after Eleanor's confession, I thought it might be worth taking a closer look." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as Blake pushed the file toward her. The documents were yellowed with age, the edges frayed, but the details were still clear. A name stood out among the list of suspects: Edward Fenton. Her heart skipped a beat. The very same Fenton who had been too eager to cooperate with the investigation, the one who had been hiding something beneath his smooth exterior. Now it seemed that his past was entwined with the very roots of this estate, buried under years of secrecy. "Fenton?" Miss Marple murmured, her voice thick with realization. "What's his connection to this case?" Blake's brow furrowed. It was a fraud case. A complicated one, involving a number of investors who were swindled out of large sums of money. One of the key figures was a man named George Waller, an old associate of Fenton's. Waller disappeared shortly after the case was closed, and many believed he'd simply run off with the money. But there were rumors, unsubstantiated at the time, that Fenton was involved in some way. His name came up in a few of the testimonies, but nothing concrete was ever proven. The case was dropped, and it seemed to fade away. Miss Marple leaned forward, her mind racing. Waller had been a shadow, a name lost in time, but now he was back. The connection was clearer than ever. The old case wasn't just a forgotten footnote in the history of the estate. It was the very reason Eleanor had been drawn to the bell tower, the very reason she had uncovered something she shouldn't have. Fenton wasn't just an innocent bystander then, Miss Marple mused aloud, almost to herself. He was involved, and it's no coincidence that he's here now, back at the estate after all these years. He must have had a hand in something bigger. Rutherford, who had been silent up until this point, suddenly stood, his face pale and tense. "This is absurd," he said, his voice strained. "Fenton had nothing to do with that case." "You're wrong, Mr. Rutherford," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice firm but measured. "You've been protecting a man who has far more blood on his hands than you realize. The fraud, the missing money, the ties to your own family. Fenton isn't just a businessman. He's someone who will stop at nothing to cover his tracks." Blake looked between them, his confusion evident. "So, what are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That Fenton had something to do with Eleanor's disappearance?" "No," Miss Marple said slowly. "Not just Eleanor's disappearance. I believe he's been using her as a pawn in something much larger, a web of lies that stretches back to that fraud case. Eleanor had found something Fenton was desperate to keep hidden. It wasn't just about money or a secret. It was about ensuring that the past stayed buried. She turned her gaze back to the file, scanning the pages once more. Then her eyes locked on a small detail, a barely noticeable mention of a debt that had been paid off just before Waller's disappearance. The payment had come from an unknown source, but the date was significant. It was the same time that Fenton had begun his position at Bell Tower Estate, just as Waller vanished. Miss Marple's heart pounded as she put the pieces together. Waller hadn't disappeared by choice. He had been silenced, and Fenton, now entrenched in the workings of the estate, had played a part in making sure the truth never surfaced. Do you see it now? Miss Marple asked, looking at Blake. The money, the disappearance of Waller, the way Fenton wormed his way into the estate's dealings. He's been covering his tracks for years. And Eleanor, with her inquisitive mind, was the one who started peeling back the layers. Blake's eyes widened. So Eleanor uncovered the truth about Waller's disappearance. She was getting too close to something Fenton didn't want found. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. She started asking questions that led her down a dangerous path, one that threatened to expose not only Fenton's involvement in the fraud, but also the much darker truth about Waller's fate. That's why she was killed. And the key, the one Eleanor was trying to use to unlock the bell tower, wasn't just a symbol. It was her way of revealing the connection between Fenton and Waller, a way of exposing the truth before it was too late. Rutherford stood motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. "You're saying Fenton, he killed my daughter?" Miss Marple looked at him, her expression soft but resolute. "Not just your daughter, Mr. Rutherford. He's been hiding in the shadows for years, carefully weaving a web of deceit. Eleanor was only the latest casualty in a much larger scheme." Blake rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to process the weight of the revelation. "So, where does that leave us? How do we prove any of this?" Miss Marple didn't hesitate. "We go back to the bell tower. Eleanor's obsession with it was more than just a whim. She knew that the tower hid the final clue, the piece of evidence that would tie everything together. Fenton may have tried to cover it up, but he can't erase the past completely." With newfound resolve, the trio made their way to the bell tower. As they approached, Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to the key. Eleanor had been right to trust it, and now it was time to see where it would lead them. The bell tower stood like a silent sentinel, its weathered stone hiding secrets that had been buried too long. Miss Marple stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning every corner, every crevice. Something was here, she knew it. The answer, the final piece, was within reach. And then, just as they were about to give up, Miss Marple's gaze landed on an old wooden chest hidden beneath a layer of dust. She approached it carefully, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the lid. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened the chest. Inside, she found a collection of old documents, some yellowed with age, others hidden beneath layers of protective paper. But it wasn't the documents that caught her eye. It was the small silver locket nestled among them, engraved with the same initials Eleanor had scrawled in her confession. Miss Marple's fingers trembled as she held the locket, knowing, without a doubt, that it was the final piece of the puzzle. The connection between the past and the present was complete, and with this locket, the truth would finally be exposed. But as she turned to Blake and Rutherford, she felt a chill in the air, a sense that the shadows of the past were still watching, waiting for their moment to strike. The real story wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The silence in the bell tower was almost suffocating, broken only by the faint creaking of the old wooden beams as they settled in the morning light. Miss Marple stood there for a moment, holding the locket in her palm, the weight of it pulling at her thoughts. There was something intrinsically significant about this small piece of jewelry, something that could unravel the tangled web of deceit that had ensnared them all. She could feel it in her bones. Blake and Rutherford were both watching her closely, their eyes filled with anticipation. Miss Marple had already begun to piece the puzzle together in her mind, but there was still one crucial detail left to confirm. She knew that the locket, much like the bell tower itself, was part of a much larger narrative, one rooted deeply in the lies of the past. "Miss Marple," Blake said, breaking the stillness, "what does this locket mean? Why is it important?" She held it up to the light, inspecting it closely. The engraving was faint, but there was something unmistakable about the initials etched on the back. "E.W. Eleanor Waller," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. This locket belonged to her. She must have kept it as a memento from someone she loved. But more than that, it ties her to the old case, to the financial scandal. Waller's disappearance wasn't just about the fraud. It was personal. And this locket, it's a symbol of the ties that bind him to Fenton. Rutherford looked pale, his mouth agape as he tried to process the significance of the words. "You mean to say that Eleanor was involved with George Waller?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze never leaving the locket. "Not just involved, Mr. Rutherford. She was probably his daughter, or at least someone very close to him. This locket was meant to be a keepsake, a piece of history that she held on to, perhaps to remind her of the truth that had been hidden from everyone for so long." Blake took a step forward, his brow furrowing. "But if that's the case, why didn't she ever say anything? Why keep the secret for so long?" "Because she was afraid," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Afraid of the consequences, afraid of what it might mean for the Rutherford family, afraid of what it might mean for Fenton. And perhaps she was afraid of herself. What would happen if she came forward with the truth?" Rutherford, clearly on edge, suddenly erupted in frustration. "This is madness! Eleanor never told me anything about Waller. She didn't know him, didn't want anything to do with him. And Fenton, he has nothing to do with any of this." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes darted to the corners of the room, avoiding direct contact. His reaction was telling, too defensive, too eager to dismiss the connections that were so plainly evident. It was the sort of behavior that always sparked Miss Marple's intuition, the kind that hinted at a deeper truth hidden just beneath the surface. "I think you're lying, Mr. Rutherford," Miss Marple said softly. "And I think you know more than you've let on." He recoiled, his face reddening with anger. "How dare you accuse me?" "I'm not accusing you," she interjected, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm simply observing what's in front of me. The more you deny, the more you reveal. You were too quick to dismiss the connection between Eleanor and Waller. It's as though you're trying to erase the past, to rewrite it in your favor." Blake, sensing the tension rising, stepped forward. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Miss Marple. We're still in the dark about many aspects of this case. Maybe we should focus on getting to the truth through other means." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with a quiet determination. "Oh, we will, Inspector. But I believe the truth is more evident than you think. Mr. Rutherford's reaction is a piece of the puzzle, one I'm certain of now." She turned her attention back to Rutherford, whose clenched fists betrayed his frustration. "Tell me, Mr. Rutherford, where were you the night Eleanor disappeared?" He hesitated, his gaze flitting nervously to the side. I was in my study. I told you this before." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze intense. "And you didn't leave your study once? No phone calls, no meetings with anyone?" "I don't remember any calls. I was working, trying to finish some papers for the estate." Blake frowned, clearly skeptical. "You were working all night?" I had a lot to do," Rutherford stammered, his voice tightening. "The estate's finances have been a mess since my late wife passed away. I've had to pick up the slack." Miss Marple didn't believe him. There was something off about his story, something that didn't line up. She'd heard too many inconsistencies from Rutherford already, and his defensiveness was the final clue she needed. She rose from her chair slowly, deliberately. "I think we should test your story, Mr. Rutherford. It might be time to ask a few people to speak up." Blake, sensing Miss Marple's resolve, nodded in agreement. "What do you have in mind?" Miss Marple looked at the clock on the wall and then turned her eyes back to Rutherford. "A test of character. If I'm right, you've been hiding something. So let's see how well you can lie to my face." Before Rutherford could protest, Miss Marple gestured to Blake, who was already signalling to one of the officers outside. Moments later, 2 uniformed officers entered, holding a stack of phone records. Blake stepped forward, flipping through them. "I've asked the staff to retrieve the estate's phone records from the night in question," Blake said. "And, Mr. Rutherford, we've found something that doesn't quite add up." Rutherford's face paled as Blake placed a particular sheet in front of him. "You made a phone call, Mr. Rutherford, at 11:30 p.m. to a number that until now hadn't been traced back to anyone on the estate. Care to explain that?" Miss Marple watched as Rutherford's face changed, his eyes darting nervously, his fingers twitching slightly. It was the first crack in his composure. His earlier confidence vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic that he couldn't suppress. I don't know what you're talking about," Rutherford said, his voice wavering. "I didn't make any phone call." Blake's expression was stern. "The records say otherwise, Mr. Rutherford. You made a call to a number outside the estate." "You didn't tell us about it before," Rutherford stammered, his hands clenching at his sides. I don't remember. It was a mistake. I didn't—" Miss Marple interrupted him, her voice sharp as a knife. "The truth is, Mr. Rutherford, you've been hiding something, and now we've caught you. The phone call wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. But more than that, it's the first real crack in your story." Blake stepped forward, his hand gripping Rutherford's shoulder. "I suggest you start telling us the truth. You're running out of time." Rutherford's face was contorted with frustration, the facade crumbling rapidly as his secret began to unravel. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again. Miss Marple watched him carefully, sensing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. "Start with the phone call," she urged, her voice calm yet unyielding. "Tell us who you called." Rutherford swallowed hard, his chest heaving with the weight of his deception. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for him to make a final decision. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I called Fenton," he admitted, his eyes downcast. I was trying to warn him. I knew that Eleanor was getting too close. I couldn't let her expose the truth." Miss Marple's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. The final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. The game was far from over, but she was no longer in the dark. Rutherford's confession hung in the air like a dark cloud. The revelation that he had warned Fenton, his association with the mysterious man who had long been the focus of suspicion, was a crucial breakthrough. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her that the unravelling of this case wasn't over. In fact, she suspected the worst was yet to come. Blake, still in shock from the revelation, turned to the officers who had been watching the exchange. "Get Fenton, now. We need to bring him in. It's time he answers for his part in this." But as Blake moved to issue his orders, something unsettling happened. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air thickening with an unseen tension. Miss Marple, ever vigilant, turned slowly toward the door where an officer had been standing guard. His face had drained of colour, his mouth agape in disbelief. "There's been a problem, ma'am," the officer stammered, stepping forward. "The evidence, we can't find it." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She looked toward Blake, whose expression instantly darkened. "What do you mean, can't find it?" "The locket," the officer continued, voice trembling. "It's gone. The evidence we took from Mr. Rutherford's study. Someone's taken it." Miss Marple's mind raced. The locket had been the key to unravelling everything. It connected Eleanor Waller to Fenton, to Rutherford, to the web of deceit they had all been entangled in. Whoever had stolen it had just pulled the rug out from under the entire investigation. Blake was already moving, his face grim as he barked orders to the officers. "Search the building. No one leaves until we find out who took it. Everyone's a suspect now." As the officers dispersed to comb the estate, Miss Marple felt a cold resolve settle over her. Someone was working against them, someone who understood the value of the locket and wanted it hidden, buried, destroyed. But who? And why? Rutherford, his face contorted with guilt and fear, began to speak again. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. The locket wasn't supposed to—" "Enough!" Miss Marple interrupted sharply, her eyes hardening. "I know what you're trying to do, Mr. Rutherford. You think I don't see it, but I'm not letting you distract me. The locket is the key, and I won't let it slip away." She turned her back on him, her mind whirring. Whoever had taken the locket was someone who didn't want the truth to come to light. But the real question was, who had the resources to steal evidence right from under their noses? Blake returned a few moments later, his face pale and frustrated. "Nothing. No sign of it. It's like it vanished into thin air. We've locked down the estate. No one leaves. No one enters." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she processed the news. "Then it's time to think like a thief." She stepped toward the window, her eyes scanning the estate's sprawling grounds. The large stone walls, the overgrown garden, the dense thicket surrounding the property. It was clear that someone had planned this, perhaps even anticipating a moment like this. If the locket was truly taken from Rutherford's study, it hadn't been by accident. It had been stolen with intention. Blake's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're thinking someone inside the estate did it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind piecing the puzzle together with an uncanny clarity. "Yes, Inspector. Someone with access to the study, someone who could move about without raising suspicion. The theft wasn't random. It was strategic." "And that means it could be anyone," Blake said, his tone turning more frustrated. Miss Marple turned to him, meeting his gaze with unshakable calm. "Exactly. But that also means we have a chance. We know they're here, hiding among us. Whoever took it will make a mistake, and we'll catch them." The tension in the room was palpable, and Blake seemed to be weighing her words carefully. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "What's the next move, then?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a slight smile. "The game has changed, Inspector, and now we must play it differently. We can't go after them directly. Not yet. But we can stir the waters, test their reactions, draw them out." Blake raised an eyebrow. "You have something in mind?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. I want to bring everyone together, suspects, witnesses, and anyone else who might have insight into the theft. We'll host a meeting, one that seems innocuous, but will make the thief believe they've been given the upper hand. Let's see how they respond." Blake hesitated, but then agreed. "All right. But we'll need everyone in the same room." And if the thief's one of them, they won't take kindly to being trapped. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Which is exactly why we'll use the element of surprise. We'll create a scenario where their reaction is the key to revealing them. It took some time to gather the group, Rutherford, Blake, the officers, and a few others who had been involved in the investigation. Miss Marple had them all seated in the large drawing room of the estate, each person stewing in their own thoughts. The air felt thick, a pressure building in the room that made every second feel like an eternity. Miss Marple walked around the room, her gaze sweeping over each face. She knew what she was looking for. Any change in expression, a twitch, a nervous glance. She could feel their eyes on her, and yet she held her ground, refusing to show weakness. Blake stood beside her, a quiet support. "Shall we begin?" She nodded, then addressed the room. "I know you're all aware of the circumstances, the theft of the locket and the continued investigation into the events surrounding Eleanor Waller's disappearance." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle. "We've been searching for the truth, but now it's time for each of you to be honest with us. If any of you know anything about the locket's disappearance, now is the time to speak up." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Miss Marple's eyes met Rutherford's, noting how his fingers were twitching ever so slightly, betraying his unease. But it was Fenton, who had been quietly observing from the corner, that caught her attention next. His expression was impassive, too impassive. Blake, sensing the shift in the room, added, "We know someone among us took the evidence, and we're not going to stop until we find out who." The room went still. Every person in it had something to lose. But only one of them had the most to gain from keeping the locket out of their hands. Miss Marple glanced once more at Fenton, who seemed to be taking extra care to avoid making eye contact. And for the first time, she saw it, a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of recognition. And then, a moment of fear, quickly masked by indifference. It was just enough to make her certain. The thief was close, but now Miss Marple knew where to look next. As Miss Marple stood at the head of the gathering in the drawing room, her gaze fixated on Fenton, who seemed to shrink beneath her scrutiny. The weight of the room's tension was palpable, each person silently wondering if the truth was finally about to surface. But despite the eerie calmness in his expression, she could sense the crack in his armor, the flicker of fear that he could not entirely hide. Blake, ever watchful, kept his hand close to his side, where the pistol hung in its holster. The silence stretched on, stretching each second into what felt like an eternity. But then, just as Miss Marple prepared to speak once more, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the hallway, a shattering noise, as if something fragile had been thrown violently to the ground. Everyone in the room jumped, eyes widening. Fenton, his gaze snapping away from Miss Marple, was the first to move, but it was clear he wasn't quite as calm as he had been moments before. The color drained from his face, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Without waiting for anyone to give direction, he bolted toward the door. "Wait," Blake called. But Fenton was already gone, disappearing down the hallway at a pace that bordered on frantic. Miss Marple's instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't an ordinary reaction. Fenton was hiding something that had just made him crack. Blake cursed under his breath and followed in pursuit, but Miss Marple didn't move. Her attention shifted to the sound that had shattered the tense atmosphere, the sound of footsteps running in the opposite direction. Quickly, she turned, her eyes locking with the officer who had been guarding the door earlier. His face had gone pale, and his expression was that of someone who had just seen a ghost. Before she could ask what had happened, the officer spoke in a low, trembling voice. "Miss Marple, it's Waller. She's gone." The words hit like a slap in the face. Eleanor Waller, she had been the one thread, the faint hope that could tie everything together. And now, the woman they'd been trying to locate, who had been under guard in one of the upstairs rooms, had vanished. Blake, still chasing Fenton down the hallway, had not heard the officer's words. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing the sudden upheaval together. Waller's disappearance, on top of the destruction of evidence, the theft of the locket, meant the situation had just escalated. If Waller was truly gone, it could only mean one thing. The person who had orchestrated this entire conspiracy was closer than anyone had suspected. And now they had the perfect opportunity to strike again. With deliberate calm, Miss Marple turned to the officer, her voice icy. "Call for backup. Get every available officer in the house. We can't allow anyone to leave." She turned on her heel, moving swiftly toward the grand staircase. Her mind already working through the possibilities, she couldn't shake the thought that this latest twist was no accident. Waller had disappeared for a reason. Someone had taken her, and Miss Marple was certain it wasn't just to keep her from speaking. It was about control. Someone was still manipulating the situation, still one step ahead. Upstairs, the tension was thick. Blake, having caught up with Fenton, was now dragging him back into the room where the others were gathered, a grim look on his face. Fenton struggled, but Blake's grip was firm, and there was an unmistakable panic in Fenton's eyes that Miss Marple noted with growing concern. Blake shoved Fenton into a chair before turning to Miss Marple. "We need to find Waller, whoever took her. They're trying to finish what they started." But before Miss Marple could respond, a loud, shrill scream echoed from the far end of the house. It came from downstairs near the library. Without a word, Blake was off again, this time pulling Fenton along with him, while Miss Marple followed at a measured pace. She knew the answer wasn't in the pursuit of one man or woman. It was in understanding the game they were all caught in. The scream had come from Mrs. Hartley, a woman who had been working as the housekeeper for many years. She was now standing in the doorway of the library, her hands pressed to her face, her entire body shaking. The officers who had been stationed, they were quickly forming a protective line around her as she tried to speak, her words coming out in gasps. I don't understand," Mrs. Hartley stammered, clutching the doorframe for support. "The room was locked. No one could have entered, but she's—" Miss Marple stepped forward, her calm demeanor never faltering, despite the chaos building around her. "Who, Mrs. Hartley? Who is it?" Through her tear-filled eyes, Mrs. Hartley finally found the words. "The woman. The woman who was in there, Eleanor Waller. She's dead." The words landed like a stone in the pit of Miss Marple's stomach. She didn't need to ask how. The look on Mrs. Hartley's face said it all. Waller was no longer just missing. She was now the second victim. Blake pushed past the group of officers bending down to examine the body. His face was pale, his hands tightening around his weapon as he looked over the gruesome scene. Waller's body lay at an odd angle, her face twisted in terror. She had been murdered. There was no other way to describe it. "Miss Marple." Blake's voice came through tight, as though he was struggling to grasp the enormity of the situation. "This changes everything. We need to get answers now." Miss Marple didn't respond. Immediately, instead scanning the room with a level of focus that only she could manage. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Waller's murder, Fenton's anxiety, Rutherford's guilt, and the endless web of lies that had woven this house into a deadly trap. She took a deep breath, moving slowly through the room, each step deliberate. The crime was still in motion. The killer wasn't finished. And Miss Marple had one nagging thought. Whoever had killed Waller, whoever had stolen the locket and manipulated everyone, had left a trail of lies. But that trail was now thinner, more elusive. They had to be careful. One wrong move and the killer might slip away, just as they had before. Turning to Blake, Miss Marple's voice was firm. The person behind this is playing us, but they're making mistakes. They think we're only looking for answers in the present. But this crime, this conspiracy, it's always been about the past. Blake met her gaze, his eyes filled with equal parts exhaustion and determination. Then we need to look back. We need to find out who among us has been hiding their past. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes glinting with the sharp edge of resolve. Exactly. And I know exactly where to start. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But as the clock ticked on, Miss Marple knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. The killer, whoever they were, was still among them. And now, they had made their next move. The scene in the library was one of quiet horror, as officers moved in and out, carefully documenting the details of Eleanor Waller's brutal murder. The body had been carefully positioned, her lifeless form sprawled awkwardly across the floor, a garish contrast to the elegant surroundings of the room. A shattered vase lay by her side, the pieces scattered like a jigsaw puzzle, while the fireplace crackled softly in the corner, seemingly indifferent to the unfolding tragedy. Miss Marple remained on the periphery of the scene, her mind spinning, as she observed the chaotic movements of the officers and the frantic whispers of the suspects gathered in the adjoining hallway. Blake, still standing over Waller's body, looked at her with a mixture of frustration and confusion. "This doesn't make sense, Miss Marple. She was supposed to be under guard. How could someone get to her?" Blake's voice was strained, his brow furrowed, as if he were trying to make sense of the impossible. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly around the room, her eyes scanning every surface, taking in every detail. She moved as though she were not merely observing the crime scene, but somehow listening to it, as if the room itself were whispering secrets. Her gaze lingered on the broken vase, a small, delicate object, once an exquisite piece of porcelain. It had been knocked over with great force, spilling water across the floor and mixing with the blood that pooled beneath Waller's body. But what caught Miss Marple's attention wasn't just the vase. It was the trail of water leading away from it. The water had spread in an irregular pattern, suggesting someone had hastily stepped over it, leaving behind faint imprints in the carpet. But the oddity wasn't in the water. It was in the placement of the vase itself. It had been positioned at an angle, almost as though it had been intentionally set in the precise spot where it would be easily knocked over. A small detail, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most significant clues often lay in the things people overlooked. As she moved toward the far corner of the room, her gaze caught something else, a misplaced chair. It had been pushed slightly out of place, its legs scraping softly against the wooden floor. The positioning was odd, as though someone had been sitting there, only to rise in haste and abandon the chair in their rush. The chair was positioned directly in front of the only window in the room, a window that overlooked the garden. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she pondered this. The view from the window was clear, and anyone standing in front of it could easily see the comings and goings of the house from that vantage point. But there was something more. Something about the way the chair had been left behind. Her attention shifted to a small item sitting on the edge of a nearby desk, an old pocket watch, its face cracked and its hands frozen in time. The watch wasn't a piece of jewellery that Waller had been known to wear. In fact, it didn't seem to belong to her at all. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was tarnished, worn from years of use, but it was undeniably old. Far older than anything Waller had possessed. The watch was a clue, Miss Marple realized. And more importantly, it was a clue that pointed to something far deeper than the simple act of a random murder. Blake noticed her examination of the watch and stepped closer. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "It's an old family heirloom," Miss Marple replied softly, her mind already racing. "But not one that would have belonged to Waller. This was someone else's, someone who wanted to leave a message, but not an obvious one." Blake looked puzzled. "A message?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flicked over to the officers standing near the door. They were speaking in hushed tones, no doubt discussing their next steps. But Miss Marple felt a sudden shift in the air, a shift in the direction of the investigation. It was all falling into place, though in a way that few would have been able to piece together. She turned to Blake, her expression sharp. "This watch," she said slowly, "it belonged to someone in this house, and it's not here by accident." Blake shook his head in frustration. "But who?" "It's not about the watch itself, Blake. It's about the pattern of actions, the movements of the people in this house, the small, seemingly insignificant details. You see, every crime leaves behind something, no matter how small. And right now, there's one thing that stands out above all." Blake took a step back, allowing Miss Marple to continue her quiet analysis. He had learned to trust her instincts, even when they didn't seem to follow the traditional paths of logic. He knew better than to question her methods, even if he couldn't quite follow her reasoning. "There's a reason Waller was targeted," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and measured, "a reason she was kept under guard, even though it seemed unnecessary. Someone didn't want her to speak. Someone didn't want her to reveal something important." Blake nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "You think Waller knew something?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with an almost imperceptible gleam of satisfaction. "Exactly. And she wasn't the only one who knew. The answer has been staring us in the face all along." She stepped away from the desk and walked back to the far corner of the room, her fingers trailing lightly along the edge of the window. Her eyes flicked to the distant landscape, her mind grappling with the pieces of the puzzle. "It wasn't the vase," she murmured. "It wasn't the watch or the chair or even the missing locket. It was something simpler, something far more fundamental." Blake stood silent for a moment. Then his eyes widened in realization. The connections, the people in this house, everyone has a link to the past. Something tied them together. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, and we've been looking at the wrong people. The crime was never about greed or revenge. It was about secrecy, about silencing the one person who could have exposed the truth. Eleanor Waller knew too much, and someone here was determined to keep her quiet, no matter the cost." Blake stepped forward, now fully engaged in the unfolding mystery. "Who, then?" Who would go so far to protect this secret? Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the hallway where the suspects had been gathered. They were all waiting, watching, uncertain of their next move. She took a deep breath, knowing that the moment of revelation was nearly at hand. The pattern had emerged, and the answers were close. "The killer," she said softly, "is someone who's been here all along. Someone who thinks they've outsmarted us. But the truth is, Blake, the truth was never hidden. It's always been in plain sight." Blake's eyes followed her gaze. He knew what she meant. And now, with the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, he was ready to face the final confrontation. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, the air thick with suspicion. The suspects stood scattered across the grand hall, their expressions a mixture of confusion, dread, and guilt. Miss Marple, standing apart from them, took a final moment to absorb the connections she had uncovered. Blake remained at her side, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was ready for the truth, but he had no idea just how deeply the case would reach into the hearts and minds of those involved. Miss Marple's gaze flitted from one face to another, each one a mask of uncertainty. They were all connected in some way, their motives tangled like a web that no one seemed able to unravel. But Miss Marple, with her keen mind and quiet observance, knew that she was on the verge of something profound. "It's not about the watch," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else, though her words seemed to catch the attention of Blake. Blake turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "The watch is merely a distraction. It's a small part of the puzzle," she replied, her voice steady. "What we have here, Blake, is not a crime of passion or revenge, nor one driven by money or greed. This is something far darker, more complex. It's about control." Blake blinked, trying to make sense of her cryptic statement. Control? Who's trying to control whom? Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the figure standing alone in the corner, the person who had been under the most suspicion from the start, though no one had dared to accuse them outright. Charles Waller, Eleanor's estranged husband, stood with his back to the others, his face pale and drawn. The air around him seemed to vibrate with tension, and though he had remained quiet throughout the investigation, his silence spoke volumes. "Mr. Waller," Miss Marple called out softly, her voice calm but firm. He turned slowly, his face betraying the faintest hint of surprise, as though he had been lost in thought. He wasn't expecting to be singled out. Not now, not with all the others present. But there was no denying it. The pattern had finally come together. "You wanted Eleanor to be silent," Miss Marple continued, her words carrying an undeniable weight. "But it wasn't just for the reasons everyone assumed." Waller's expression remained unreadable, but his lips tightened. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. "You thought you could control her, didn't you? You thought if you could isolate her, keep her under your thumb, you'd be able to protect the secret that she had threatened to expose." Blake stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "What secret? What are you talking about?" Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from Waller, her voice softening slightly, as if trying to break through the layers of his defense. "It's not just money or power, Mr. Waller. It's something far more personal. Eleanor knew the truth about you, about your past. The past that you tried so hard to bury." Waller's lips trembled, a flicker of emotion crossing his face, but he quickly masked it. "You're mistaken. Eleanor Didn't know anything. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. You underestimate her, Mr. Waller. She was clever. She wasn't just a fragile woman at the mercy of her husband. She had seen through you long ago. Blake glanced between Miss Marple and Waller, confusion clouding his thoughts. What are you saying? What truth could Eleanor have known? Miss Marple turned back to Blake, her eyes gleaming with quiet certainty. Eleanor knew about the affair. She knew about the woman from your past, the one who had been involved with you before your marriage. The room seemed to freeze. Blake's eyes widened as he glanced at Waller, who now appeared visibly shaken, though he quickly masked it with a forced composure. You see, Miss Marple continued, Eleanor had discovered the affair long before she died. She knew that you had been involved with a woman who was now linked to a shadowy organization, one that could expose not only your infidelity, but your ties to something far more dangerous. Waller's face twisted, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wasn't denying it. Not anymore. The truth was out, and it was more damning than anyone had expected. The crime had never been about simple revenge or money. It had been about the fear of being exposed, of having a carefully constructed life shattered by the ghosts of the past. You thought Eleanor might reveal everything, didn't you? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost pitying. You feared she would use that information as leverage. You tried to control her, but when you saw she was determined to go public, you decided to silence her before she could destroy everything you had built. Waller's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt crashing down on him. I never wanted to hurt her, he whispered, his voice thick with remorse. I only wanted her to forget about the past, about that woman. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Blake, still struggling to process the unfolding revelations, took a step back. So, you killed her. You killed your own wife to keep her quiet. Waller didn't respond immediately. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath his shifting weight. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was the only way, he said, his voice shaking. I thought if I could just make her disappear, no one would know. No one would ask questions. Miss Marple's face was somber, but there was a glint of something else in her eyes, understanding, perhaps even sympathy, for a man who had been driven to madness by the fear of losing control. But in the end, Mr. Waller, you lost far more than you could have imagined. The past you tried so hard to bury has resurfaced, and now there is no escaping it. Blake stepped forward, his hand tightening around the edge of a nearby chair. You took everything from her. You didn't just take her life. You took her future, her chance to find peace, and you made sure that her voice would never be heard. Waller seemed to crumble under the weight of those words. He sank to his knees, his hands trembling as they clasped his head. I didn't know what else to do, he choked out, his voice breaking. I couldn't let her ruin everything. Miss Marple stood in silence for a moment, watching the man before her. Her heart was heavy, but her resolve remained as firm as ever. She had seen many things in her time, but there was something particularly tragic about a man so consumed by fear and shame that he would destroy the one person he had once loved. Blake glanced at her, his expression dark. What happens now? Miss Marple took a deep breath. Now we do what we must. The truth has been revealed, and while it may not bring Eleanor back, it will prevent any more lives from being lost. The room was silent, save for the distant sound of sirens approaching. The case was far from over, but at least for the moment, the hidden motives had been laid bare, and the weight of the truth would not be easily shaken. The final hour had come. The investigation had spiraled through twists, false leads, and broken truths, but now, in this dimly lit study, Miss Marple stood calm and composed, her mind sharp as a blade. Everything had been set into motion, the last pieces of the puzzle now in place. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The villain had nowhere left to go. Blake stood beside her, his expression a mixture of apprehension and resolve. He had grown accustomed to Miss Marple's way of working, her subtlety, her patience, but now that they were finally at the precipice of the truth, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of days of meticulous work. But even he could sense that, like every great detective story, the final confrontation would not go as expected. "Are you ready?" Miss Marple asked softly, her eyes narrowing slightly as they glanced toward the door, the one that would soon lead to the confrontation. Blake nodded, though his pulse quickened. He had seen the suspects come and go, heard their lies, their admissions, but now that they were on the cusp of exposing everything, he wondered if he was truly prepared for what lay beyond the door. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you?" Blake said, his voice laced with a mixture of admiration and wonder. "You knew Waller would crack, but you also knew there was more to it. There's someone else, isn't there?" Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Instead, she allowed her gaze to linger on the door, the faintest flicker of light from the hallway cutting through the gap beneath it. She had orchestrated this moment carefully, each step, each word, leading them here. "There's always more than one thread, Blake," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Waller was a man consumed by his own fear, yes, but there's someone else. A partner, someone who stood to gain far more than he did, someone who has been lurking in the shadows, pulling strings." Blake stiffened, the realization dawning upon him. Waller wasn't working alone. Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was filled with the weight of understanding. "Waller was a pawn in someone else's game, Blake. The mastermind, the true culprit, has been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike." Suddenly, the door creaked open. Standing in the threshold was Charles Waller, his face twisted with guilt and fear, his eyes red-rimmed as though he had not slept in days. His hands trembled at his sides, and for the first time since they'd met him, he seemed utterly broken. "I can't go back," he muttered under his breath, his voice ragged. "I can't. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I could stop it. Stop her from destroying everything, but it's too late. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. "It's too late for excuses, Mr. Waller, and it's too late for you to turn back." Blake took a step toward him. "What are you talking about? Who else is involved?" Waller's eyes flicked to the floor, his voice barely audible as he spoke the name. Veronica Daniels." The name hung in the air, heavy with significance. Blake turned to Miss Marple, confusion evident in his eyes. "Veronica Daniels? Who is she?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her mind already making the connections. Veronica Daniels was the woman from Waller's past, the one who had a hold over him, the one he feared would reveal his secret. But she wasn't just an old lover, was she, Mr. Waller? Waller swallowed hard, nodding slowly. No, she was the one who came to me with an offer. She knew about my ties to the organization, the one I'd tried to distance myself from, and she used that knowledge to get what she wanted. Blake turned to Miss Marple, the pieces starting to fall into place. She was the one who wanted to use Eleanor as leverage, wasn't she? Precisely, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Veronica Daniels knew about the affair, knew about the past, but she wanted more. She wanted to use that information to control Waller, to manipulate him into doing her bidding. Waller shook his head, his voice breaking. I never wanted to be part of it, but when she threatened to expose everything, to tear apart my life, I thought I could make it go away. I thought if I could just make Eleanor listen, make her understand maybe. Maybe she'd stay quiet, but I was wrong. I didn't know what I was getting into. Miss Marple took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving his face. You underestimated Veronica Daniels. You thought you could control the situation, but you were always just another pawn in her game. At that moment, the door behind them opened once more, this time more forcefully. Veronica Daniels entered, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, her presence commanding and cold. There was no hint of surprise in her eyes, no fear. She had anticipated this moment, as if she had been playing her own game all along. How quaint, Veronica said, her voice smooth, laced with a touch of amusement. Miss Marple, Blake, I knew you would find your way here eventually. But I must admit, I didn't think you'd connect all the dots so quickly. Blake's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. Don't be foolish, Blake, she said quietly, her eyes still fixed on Veronica. She's not going to run. She thinks she has won already. Veronica's smile widened, and she took a step closer, her gaze flicking from one face to the other. Oh, I have won, Miss Marple. You see, Charles wasn't my only pawn. He was merely the one who was supposed to deal with the inconvenient details. But now that you've exposed him, I suppose it's my turn to deal with the situation. Her eyes flicked toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in, but no one came. Miss Marple's face remained impassive, though her mind was whirring. You thought the past was buried, Veronica, but it was never truly forgotten, was it? You've always been a manipulator, hiding in plain sight. You used Charles, used the fear he harbored, and you played him like a well-worn fiddle. Veronica's eyes flashed with something sharp, dangerous. And now I suppose you'll be exposing. Me too, I think not. She made a sudden move, and before anyone could react, she was at the door, her hand grasping the handle as she moved toward it with surprising speed. But just as she reached the threshold, the door slammed shut with a decisive force, trapping her inside. Blake moved quickly, his instincts kicking in as he reached for his phone to call for backup. But Miss Marple stood still, her expression calm as ever. You've lost, Veronica, she said softly, almost regretfully. You've been too clever for too long, but now you're the one who's been caught in your own web. Veronica turned slowly, her face contorted with fury, and for the first time since the investigation had started, Miss Marple saw her as something more than just a schemer. Veronica was a woman pushed to the brink, someone whose own plans had finally unraveled. As the authorities arrived, the tension in the room finally began to dissolve. The trap had been set, and Veronica Daniels, once so confident in her manipulations, now stood cornered. The pieces had finally come together, and the true nature of the crime had been revealed. It was over. The game was up. And in that final, quiet moment, as the handcuffs clicked shut on Veronica's wrists, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief but satisfied sigh. She had known all along that the truth would surface. It always did. The authorities moved swiftly, taking Veronica Daniels into custody. The once confident woman who had masterminded such a complicated web of deceit now looked fragile, vulnerable, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Miss Marple watched as the officers escorted her out of the room, her hands clasped tightly. In front of her, her head down. Blake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging with relief. "That's it, then," he murmured, looking at Miss Marple with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We've cracked it. It's over." For a moment, Miss Marple remained still, her gaze thoughtful, scanning the room as though searching for something hidden. There was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a small, almost imperceptible shift that Blake didn't catch, but he knew her well enough to sense when her mind was still at work. "Miss Marple?" Blake asked, his voice tentative. She looked at him then, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "It's never truly over, Blake. Not until all the pieces have fallen into place. You've seen it before, haven't you?" Blake frowned, but before he could respond, a sudden sound came from the doorway, the soft shuffle of feet, the faintest echo of a whisper. Blake turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. A figure stepped into the room. It was Waller. Charles Waller stood there, looking disheveled and nervous, his hands wringing in front of him. His eyes darted nervously between Miss Marple and Blake, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't the broken man they had seen earlier. No, this was someone far more desperate, far more fearful. Blake's instinct was to step forward, to ask what he was doing back here, but Miss Marple stopped him with a simple gesture. She knew exactly what was happening. "Mr. Waller, what is it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, but with an edge that suggested she wasn't about to let him get away with any more deception. Waller swallowed hard, his eyes darting over his shoulder as if he were worried about being followed. I didn't want to do this," he said in a hoarse whisper. "But I have to tell you something important. It's not just Veronica. She wasn't the only one pulling the strings." Blake raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Waller took a deep breath, stepping forward, his gaze still flicking around nervously. "I lied before, about everything. Veronica, she was a part of it, yes, but there's someone else, someone you haven't considered." Miss Marple studied him closely, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Go on." Waller hesitated, then blurted out, "It was Eleanor. She knew everything. She knew about Veronica. She knew about me. She was the one who started this whole thing." Blake stared at him, confused. "Eleanor? You're saying Eleanor was in on this? The same Eleanor who—" "The same Eleanor," Waller interrupted, his voice shaking. "She's the one who started it all, not Veronica. She knew what I'd done. She knew I was hiding things, and she got involved, started making demands. But I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you because I didn't want to ruin her reputation. She's been in it with me all along. She was the mastermind." Blake's mind reeled as Waller's words sank in. Eleanor, his Eleanor, had been involved in this madness? It didn't make sense. She was so innocent, so pure in his mind, but now everything was clouded with suspicion. The pieces didn't fit. Why didn't you tell us this before? Blake asked, his voice rising. Why the hell would you keep something like that hidden? I didn't know who to trust, Waller said, his eyes darting again, his voice strained. I couldn't tell you because I didn't want her to be exposed. You don't understand. She's dangerous, Blake. I've seen it. She's playing a much deeper game, and now she knows I've spoken to you. She's not going to stop until everything is in ruins. Miss Marple remained quiet, her eyes never leaving Waller's face. She didn't seem surprised by this revelation. Instead, there was a sense of quiet confirmation in her expression. Eleanor is the true mastermind, you say? Miss Marple repeated, her voice even. Interesting, but why, Mr. Waller? What is it she wanted? Why go to such lengths? I don't know, Waller said, his voice cracking. She was always too clever, always one step ahead. She made it clear that if I didn't follow her plan, if I didn't keep quiet, she'd ruin everything. She knew about Veronica and me. She knew about my past, about the things I thought I could bury. She's using it all. And she's not stopping. She never will. Blake's heart pounded as his mind raced. Could it really be true? Could Eleanor, the woman who had seemed so perfect, so untouched, really be behind all of this? It seemed too impossible to believe, but Waller's fear, his desperation seemed genuine, and Miss Marple, as always, was calm, considering every word. She took a slow step forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked directly at Waller. You're telling me that Eleanor has been orchestrating all of this, everything from the very beginning? Waller nodded frantically. Yes. She was the one who pushed Veronica into action. She knew about the threat of exposure. She was the one who wanted to manipulate everything. For a moment, the room was silent. Blake felt the weight of this new information pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under the shock of it all. Eleanor had been the puppet master, pulling the strings, orchestrating the entire affair. It was almost impossible to comprehend. But Miss Marple, as always, was thinking several steps ahead. She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. And how do you know all of this, Mr. Waller? Why are you telling us now? Waller's face darkened, his eyes shifting with a new, unsettling intensity. Because she's here. She's been watching me. She's watching us right now. She knows I've told you everything. Before Blake could react, a sound broke the tension, a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under a slight weight, and then, out of nowhere, Eleanor stepped into the room. Her presence was almost ethereal, calm, composed, as if nothing had changed. But her eyes gleamed with something dangerous, something hidden beneath the surface. Did you really think you could expose me, Charles? Eleanor said, her voice smooth, almost amused. I told you once, and I'll tell you again. You can't. Hide from me, you never could. Waller staggered backward, fear flashing across his face. You knew. You knew I'd talk. Of course I knew, Eleanor replied, her smile cold. And you were never going to be able to stop me. You were always a tool, Charles, a means to an end, nothing more. Blake's hand instinctively went to his sidearm again, but Miss Marple raised a hand, signaling him to stay calm. There was no panic in her, not even a hint of surprise. She had known all along. You were the one who planted the seed, Eleanor, Miss Marple said, her voice low but certain. You've been manipulating everyone. The case wasn't about Veronica. It was about you, all along. Eleanor's eyes flicked briefly toward Miss Marple, and in that moment Blake saw it, a flicker of something like respect. Eleanor had underestimated the detective, but now, in this moment, she realized she was facing someone who could match her cunning. The last twist of the case had come, and Eleanor's mask was slipping. The true mastermind had finally shown herself. Eleanor's smile never faltered, even as she saw Waller's trembling hands and the officer's growing readiness to move in. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Miss Marple remained poised, her eyes glimmering with quiet triumph, but also something else, something darker, as though she knew that even in victory there could still be a price to pay. Blake's grip on his weapon tightened, but Miss Marple shook her head gently, signaling for him to wait. Eleanor, now fully aware that her web was unraveling, seemed to almost relish the moment. Her poised elegance was at odds with the dark, calculating gleam in her eyes. "You never did learn, did you, Charles?" Eleanor's voice was a honeyed drawl, every word deliberate, every movement choreographed. "You were always just a pawn. It was never about you." Waller's face drained of color as the truth sunk in. His fear was palpable, his hands shaking, more violently now. "You lied to me all this time. You lied about everything." Eleanor only smiled, a bitter, knowing curve of her lips. "I didn't lie, Charles. I simply gave you what you needed to believe in order to play your part, just like the rest of them." Her gaze turned to Miss Marple, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The detective, unflinching, met her eyes with that quiet, almost knowing expression that unnerved so many who had faced her. "You thought you could outsmart me," Eleanor continued, her tone no longer the soft, pleasant facade it had been, but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "You thought that just because you had all the answers, I couldn't still be several steps ahead. But I've been controlling this game from the start, Miss Marple, and now—" She paused, her smile widening. "Now you're all caught in it." Blake could feel the knot in his stomach tightening. He had never thought he'd see Eleanor like this, cold, calculating, twisted in a way that was impossible to reconcile with the woman he thought he knew. This was not just the work of a criminal. This was something deeper, something far more insidious. Eleanor had manipulated them all, everyone, every step of the way. "I'm afraid that you've misunderstood, Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly, her voice unwavering in the face of Eleanor's growing intensity. "You think you've won, but the truth is far more complicated than you've allowed yourself to believe." Eleanor's smile faltered for just a moment, and that was all Miss Marple needed. "You see, Eleanor, all your careful maneuvering was built on one fatal flaw, the belief that you could control everything. That's what I saw when I first examined the situation. Every action you took was based on a misconception. You thought that the rest of us wouldn't see the thread that connects all of your actions, the one mistake you made in the most important part of your plan." Blake watched as Eleanor's facade cracked just slightly. She hadn't expected Miss Marple to be so calm, so in control. The detective had always been one step ahead, even when the others had assumed they had the upper hand. And what was that, Miss Marple? Eleanor's voice was almost a challenge now, as though daring the detective to expose her, to lay bare her schemes. "The mistake was in your relationship with Charles Waller," Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp with insight. "You underestimated him. You saw him as a puppet, yes, but you never considered that he might start pulling his own strings. I noticed it, you see. His fear was genuine, but it was also a clue. It was how he reacted when you first entered the scene, how he tried to distance himself from you. You made him feel too small, too weak. You thought that would make him comply. But you missed something. the very human element you believed you could control. Blake didn't understand at first, but Miss Marple continued, patiently unraveling the complex layers of deception that had hidden the truth for so long. Waller was never the true accomplice, Eleanor, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. You convinced him that he had no choice, that his past would come back to haunt him. But when the pressure mounted, he cracked. His guilt over his own actions led him to reconsider. And that's when you made your second mistake. You gave him a way out without realizing it. You assumed he would cling to you, but in doing so, you gave him the chance to redeem himself. Waller's head snapped up at this, his face a mixture of guilt and shock. I didn't want to be a part of it. But I was so scared. I thought she had me cornered. You let fear control you, Charles, Miss Marple said gently. But you did the right thing by coming forward in the end. You've taken the first step toward redemption. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, the frustration evident on her face. You think you can save him? You think that just by exposing me you've won? Her voice rose, full of venom. I've already won, Miss Marple, and when you realize that, it will be too late. Her words, though laced with arrogance, were now tinged with desperation. Miss Marple, ever composed, remained silent for a moment, letting Eleanor stew in her own anger. Blake could feel the air crackling with tension, the undeniable sense that something more was coming, something that would change everything. I don't need to win, Eleanor, Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the silence, like a blade. I just need to be right. The finality in her words hung in the air. Blake could feel his heart race, the realization dawning on him that Miss Marple had already won in a way that no one else could understand. Eleanor was cornered now, with nowhere left to run, no more tricks to play. The detective had peeled back the layers of deceit, exposing the carefully constructed lie for what it was, fragile and crumbling. But even as Miss Marple spoke, something in Eleanor shifted. A cold, calculating smile reappeared on her lips, a glint in her eyes that told Blake everything he needed to know. The woman standing before them was not someone who would go down quietly. She was dangerous, a predator who had been playing a long game, and now, with her back to the wall, she would do anything to escape. And as Blake watched, he realized with a sickening certainty that the case wasn't quite over yet. Eleanor wasn't going to give up without one final act, one last desperate move. Eleanor's smile faded as her eyes locked with Miss Marple's. You think you've won? She asked, almost whispering now, but with a chilling certainty. You haven't seen the end game. Before anyone could react, she turned on her heel, sprinting toward the door. The officers moved too slowly, and in that split second, Eleanor was out of sight. Blake cursed under his breath and moved toward the door, but Miss Marple stopped him. No, she said simply, her voice cool, but with an edge of finality. It's not over yet, Blake, but I'm certain now. We'll catch her. We always do. And as the door clicked shut behind them, Blake felt that cold knot tighten in his chest. The chase wasn't over. Not yet. Justice had been served, but for some, it was just the beginning. The case had closed, the pieces of the puzzle neatly arranged. The authorities, satisfied with Miss Marple's guidance, had quickly swept in to tie up the loose ends. Charles Waller was no longer a suspect, though the guilt over his participation in Eleanor's scheme would likely haunt him for the rest of his life. Eleanor, for all her cunning, had underestimated the calm determination of a mind like Miss Marple's. She had disappeared, of course, vanished as quickly as she had appeared, but there was no doubt in Blake's mind that she would be found. People like her always returned to make one last move, like a snake seeking to strike from the shadows. Blake adjusted his coat as he stood in the doorway of the old manor, watching the last of the officers disperse, the fog of the evening swirling around them. It was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones. He could feel the weight of the case lift off his shoulders, yet something still gnawed at him. He turned to look at Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the officer's departure. Her expression was unreadable, the familiar sharpness in her gaze replaced by something that looked almost like quiet contemplation. She wasn't smiling now as she had when she'd cracked the case. No, this time there was a solemnity to her stance, a subtle hint that the story wasn't quite finished. "Well, Blake," she said softly, her voice carrying just the right amount of warmth. "It seems our work here is done. Another case solved." "Indeed," Blake replied, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. He glanced over at her. "You don't look very satisfied, Miss Marple. Don't tell me you're not relieved that Eleanor's off the streets." Miss Marple turned, looking at him with a slight furrow in her brow. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small shake of her head. "Relief is a luxury we don't often afford ourselves, Blake. There's always something more." Blake frowned. "More? What do you mean?" She hesitated for just a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. Then her gaze shifted to the ground, her thoughts drifting to something distant, something unseen. "There's something unsettling about this whole case. Something that doesn't quite fit. It's not Eleanor's escape that worries me, nor her manipulations. It's what's left behind." Blake's brow furrowed, a ripple of confusion crossing his face. "But we got everything, didn't we? She was pulling the strings all along. She's the one who orchestrated everything, the false evidence, the manipulation of people's emotions. We've seen her true face." "Yes, we have," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "And yet there's a small detail that lingers in my mind. One that no one else has mentioned." Blake waited, his impatience growing. "What detail?" Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, her eyes scanning the distance as if looking for something just out of reach. She finally spoke, her voice quieter, almost reflective. "The cipher. The code Eleanor left behind in her apartment. It seemed insignificant at first, just a series of numbers and letters, but I believe it wasn't meant to be solved immediately. It was designed to lead us in a different direction, one that hasn't fully revealed itself." Blake's heart skipped a beat. "A code?" "Indeed," Miss Marple continued, her voice gaining a steady rhythm. "It wasn't part of the evidence we initially focused on, but I've been thinking about it since the first time we discovered it. When she left her apartment, Eleanor was in a rush, but she made sure to leave a message for someone, whether on purpose or by accident." Blake clenched his jaw. "You're telling me that after everything we missed something that important?" Miss Marple sighed softly, though her tone held no reproach. "I don't think it was missed, Blake. I think it was deliberately overlooked. The authorities were too focused on her escape, the immediate danger she posed, that they didn't take the time to consider the smaller, quieter pieces." Blake ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. "So you think the code means something? Like she was leaving us a trail?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze turning far away. Yes, I do. The cipher doesn't just reveal a message. It hints at something much deeper, something connected to her past. I believe Eleanor's escape is only part of the story, Blake. There's a whole other mystery behind the scenes, and this code may be the key to unraveling it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Blake found himself staring into the night, as though the answer might materialize from the mist that now gathered at the edge of the property. The air felt heavy, laden with the kind of tension that only the end of a case could bring. Yet, the nagging feeling that Miss Marple was right, a feeling that wouldn't let him go, hung in the air like a fog he couldn't shake. "I don't know how to feel about this, Miss Marple," Blake said finally, his voice thick with thought. "We've stopped a dangerous woman, but now you're telling me there's more to the story. More we didn't catch." Miss Marple's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "That's the thing about mysteries, Blake. They never truly end. Every answer leads to another question." He stared at her, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of her words. She was right. This case, despite its apparent conclusion, hadn't really come to an end. There was always a hidden layer, always something left behind to be uncovered, something that would demand their attention again. Blake shook his head slightly, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You make it sound like this is just the beginning." "It is," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm. "Every case we solve opens the door to the next. But for now, Blake, we rest, until the next one comes." As they turned to leave the manor behind them, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just walking away from a solved case. There was a sense that the road ahead, though calm and peaceful for now, was still fraught with untold dangers and unsolved riddles. Eleanor was only the first player in a game far grander and far darker than either of them could have imagined. And as they walked into the quiet night, the mysteries of the past and the unknown future lingered like shadows, ever present, never fully fading.